If you don't know Pinotage, or if you think it's just Pinot Noir going through a midlife crisis, this video is for you. It's Pocket Wine School. I want you to picture it. You're a young lecturer in a relatively new department at a college. Your mentor is some kind of weird genius who's so good at what he does that the job he performs didn't even have a name before he started doing it. He's been working on some kind of bizarre experiment in his workshop, and you're really interested to see how it plays out. Only, he's just gotten a new job. What's more, he's taken off in a hurry, and you come to work to find that the cleanup crew is already tearing up his workshop. At this point, only you know about his bizarre experiment. You burst in, hoping against hope that they haven't ripped the abandoned experiment to shreds, and somehow, magically, the most important parts of that experiment are left intact. And yes, they've been abandoned by their creator, but you feel in your gut that there's something there, something worth preserving. You don't know how you know, but you do. That something worth preserving was a handful of seeds. Not even a handful. 4 of them. And with a little help from you, those 4 seeds grow into something that will eventually become a part of your country's cultural identity. The mad genius we're discussing here is Abraham Perold. He was the first professor of viticulture at the University of Stellenbosch in the Western Cape of South Africa. Stellenbosch is well known nowadays, being South Africa's premier wine region, especially for its production of bold, expressive Cabernet Sauvignon. But this is the Stellenbosch of 1925. It had been a Dutch settlement since the 17th century and had also served as a British military base. But Abraham Perold was after something else. This is a man who introduced 177 grape varieties to South Africa. For that alone, he would have merited a mention in the who's who of wine history, or at least having his picture up at the local laundromat. But it was the result of one experiment in cross-pollination in an open-air garden, no less, that cemented his legacy. One of South Africa's most widely planted grapes historically was the French Cinsault grape. In France, it's an important part of the famous Rhone blends, as well as featuring in Provence-style rosé. South Africans referred to the grape as Hermitage and had been making Hermitage-based wine since the 1850s. Perold's innovation was to allow the Cinsault grapevine in his garden to pollinate another French cultivar, Pinot Noir. All he asked was that they not use his parents' bed. The 2 grapes have very little in common other than nationality. Cinsault is vigorous and fruity. Pinot Noir is fragile and leans easily towards earthiness. But this cross-pollination, literally the pollen of one plant fertilizing the flowers of another, resulted in 4 different seeds, which Perold planted in his garden. Right around this time, Perold was essentially poached by a wine cooperative called KWV, which is still around today. He essentially forgot about the plants as he began his move. Fortunately, a young lecturer named Charlie Nijhaas had not forgotten about the 4 seeds. He managed to rescue them from Perold's abandoned garden and, with the help of C.J. Theron, Perold's replacement at the university, moved them to an academic nursery, which is just as geeky as it sounds. All 4 plants grew to maturity. Nijhaas and Theron, who by this time had brought Perold back in for advice, selected the best performing plant and registered it as a new variety. But what to call it? At first it was simply called Perold's Hermitage crossed with Pinot Noir. Eventually they decided to shorten Hermitage and Pinot into one word and landed on Hermanoir. True. And then decided to go with Pinotage. So how long did it take to turn the new grape into wine? That didn't happen until 1941, when it was made as an unlabeled wine at Myrtle Grove. So what did Abraham Perold think of the wine made from his creation? Who knows? He died right before it was made. By 1959, South African winemakers had gotten sufficiently good at crafting Pinotage wine to win their first award, first prize at the Cape Wine Show. That wine was bottled 2 years later, and the label featured for the first time the word Pinotage. By this time, it was rapidly becoming South Africa's signature grape. Unfortunately, the rest of the world was slow to appreciate it. British wine professionals in the 1970s, tasting the wines for the first time, found it barely tolerable. And these were people who actively ate Marmite. So while this may smack of old world snobbery, and there certainly is that, it's also true that Pinotage can sometimes have aromas that are off-putting. And to explain, I need to talk about juicy fruit gum. So there is a byproduct of yeast fermentation called isoamyl acetate. Basically, when isoamyl alcohol, which is also called fusel alcohol or even fusel oil, reacts with acetic acid, which is present in wine, but most of it know it as vinegar, it forms isoamyl acetate. In situations like whiskey distillation, the aromas associated with isoamyl acetate aren't really wanted, and they're usually put aside for other uses. What are these aromas? It depends on how much isoamyl is present. In limited amounts, it's most commonly thought of as banana. A little more, and it's jackfruit. More than that, it's rotten banana. And more than that, it's nail polish remover. Yeah, you know that aroma. So when whiskey distilleries in late 19th century Chicago found themselves with surplus isoamyl acetate, the Wrigley Chewing Gum Company found a use for it. A little bit to flavor some plain chewing gum, and voila! The slightly tropical flavor of juicy fruit was born. I will add in, allegedly. Wrigley protects the recipe as a trade secret, although this is definitely the prevailing theory about the gum's origin. And it's highly unlikely that whiskey distillation remains the source today. What's this have to do with Pinotage? Well, the grape seems prone to develop these isoamyl acetate flavors in high amounts if not grown and vinified carefully. In good hands, Pinotage develops the light banana flavors associated with wines like Beaujolais Nouveau. In less careful hands, it can smell like flaming paint thinner. Nevertheless, by the late 1980s, Pinotage was headed for a new day. In 1987, the Kanonkop wine estate, the Stellenbosch producers most closely associated with Pinotage, won the Diners Club Wine of the Year award. And then in the early parts of the 1990s, apartheid unraveled and in 1994 ended. This was the absolute best thing to happen to any and everyone within 1,000 miles of South Africa, except producers of Pinotage. See, now that South Africa, and in particular the South African wine industry, was open to the rest of the world, Pinotage was suddenly eclipsed by admittedly excellent expressions of more familiar grapes like Syrah and Cabernet Sauvignon. The old prejudices about South Africa's native grape had resumed, even though producers like Kanonkop and many others continued to make high-quality Pinotage wines. But by the late 1990s, the good wine finally went out. Pinotage once again began to take the national stage, and even the global one. The grape is now grown in California, Brazil, New Zealand, Washington State, Canada, Zimbabwe, and Israel. And of course, South Africa. So what does it taste like? Well, it really depends. Like with Chardonnay and Chenin Blanc, the grape growing and winemaking can have a powerful influence. Hot temperatures at harvest can aggravate those isoamyl flavors. So can hot fermentations, which, if it's not already the title of an erotic wine novel, then I call dibs. Therefore, while the bulk wines may do in a pinch, they're not a great way to judge the overall quality of the wine. At its best, Pinotage is known for its smoky notes, along with dark fruit flavors and licorice overtones. Delicate wines may be floral, while heartier wines might have tobacco aromas. Even this is dependent on the style of wine being made. In addition to regular red Pinotage, there is also rosé Pinotage, sparkling Pinotage, plus fortified Pinotage in the style of port. And in 2007, Mellicent Vineyards produced its first vintage of white Pinotage to critical acclaim. Here, the standard dark fruit is replaced by tropical, creamy notes. But maybe you want to ease into Pinotage. Maybe you're nervous because you jumped straight into bed with Merlot and got your heart broken. If so, there's no better place to start than South Africa's classic Cape blends. They can contain any number of other grapes, but 30 to 70% of it will always be Pinotage. So if you're ready to take the leap, here's a few brands I like. Painted Wolf the Den, KWV the Mentors, and if you've got a chunk of change to spend, grab a bottle of Kanonkop Black Label, and the links are in the description below.